I want to understand your argument. One is inequality leads to social negatives, like homicide. Second argument is inequality leads to this big flood of investment money, pool of money. And if there's an increase in the supply of this, then they're going to have to take riskier ventures to get a decent return. And that risk jeopardizes economic growth.
Yes.
It just goes back to stability. You have
So I understand that
moving it around.
Are there any other arguments?
There's a second part to mine is that modern economies rely on education and high human capital for long-term growth. Income inequality causes education to become out of reach for an ever larger number of citizens. So I just like to quote from Branko Milanovic, World Bank economist. He writes, widespread education has become the secret to growth, and broadly accessible education is difficult to achieve unless a society has a relatively even income distribution. So eventually, if you let inequality fester and people aren't getting jobs, jobs will eventually be outsourced to regions with a better educated workforce. And you lose jobs, you have lower production efficiency, and your economy suffers.
That's interesting. I'll tell you why. You're arguing that Saudi Arabia doesn't have a good educational system. You've got multi-billionaires over there, but everybody gets free education. I've got students in my class who are from Saudi Arabia, and they can go anywhere in the world, and they get their tuition and their residence fees and their travel paid for.
Well, I would argue that Middle East is
And you
exceptionally
can't argue
rural.
that Saudi Arabia has income equality.
I would argue that's the exception to the rule, because everyone there is basically over the certain threshold for education in terms of income.
Yeah.
But a country with more reasonable GDP per capita, such
That's
as
a different argument. And I had this problem when I was reading your submissions. Are we talking about income inequality, or are we talking about poverty or low income?
well,
I mean, what
income
happens if we have
inequality.
inequality at the low end of, like, everyone's either really poor or just a little bit poor? Or the other situation, everybody's either rich or super rich. There's still inequality, but the second case doesn't sound very bad to me. The first case does. So it's not an inequality issue, it's a poverty issue. They're different.
Well, it's more just the magnitude of the gap. If you have super rich and super poor, it can't.
What happens if you
exist
have
with
rich and
stability.
super rich and super rich?
Well, then you're lucky.
Or poor and
then the rich is
super-
relatively
Yeah,
poor.
poor.
It's the same thing. There's different factors that are affecting that. The fact that they're sitting on a cajillion liters of oil, it influences the fact that
I don't happen to have an
everyone
oil
has
well in
that.
my backyard, so.
Sorry?
I don't happen to have an oil well in my backyard, so I can't.
Have you searched?
Hey, why don't we move to the, give somebody else a chance.
No. Well, did you have something to say?
I already said mine.
Yeah, he did.
You did?
Yeah, that was crime race.
Oh. And yours was
The Great Recession depression.
Great Recession debate.
I was at savings to his. And
Got it. Alrighty.
Alright, so I'm Ethan, and I'll be moving our opening statement for the.
So are you arguing that inequality fosters growth, or it just doesn't hinder it?
It doesn't hinder it,
Okay.
but we might add additional points. Economic inequality is generally presented as a negative condition when considering the societal implications. However, these disparities are meant to target incentives with penalties and rewards, and to encourage the efficient use of resources and promote economic growth. We believe that the relationship between income inequality and economic growth is a positive one, where economic growth actually results in income inequality, and income inequality as a condition can actually lead to further economic growth. One point we'd like to outline is sort of the relationship between the rich and the not as rich in a nation. So people do not necessarily have to be rich to improve their standard of living and the state of the economy. If prices are at a level that is attainable for people at the lower end of the income spectrum, then they can improve their quality of life by buying these products, which contributes to the economy, and the wealthy people in control of these products who invested, who invent new technologies and provide more goods, and they can provide these goods and services at a price level that is still attainable for people who aren't as rich. So ultimately, they kind of help each other, and you know, the money circulates and the economy is stimulated. Also, getting to our point about income inequality occurs due to economic growth. When economic growth occurs, certain individuals are able to attain greater wealth, which increases income disparities. However, these people do not gain wealth at the cost of others. In fact, even the poorest experience an increase in income and improvements in quality of life. For example, over recent years when China has been experiencing economic booms, small groups of people became very wealthy, but this resulted in more jobs for everyone and higher incomes for those people as well. So if you look at the data, you can see that poverty was decreasing at a rate similar to how income inequality was increasing. So in that sense, you know, if you look at the income of a nation as like a pie, it's not that the rich are taking bigger pieces of the pie and leaving less for the less rich. It's that the pie is getting bigger. The very rich are gaining most of that gain, but at the same time, even the poorest people are getting a bigger slice as well. So ultimately, everyone is benefiting, even though everyone's benefiting from the economic growth, even though income inequality is increasing. And also, income inequality with regards to incentives, it affects the behavior.
So are you arguing that inequality increases the size of the pie?
No, it increases
I'm
as
just
the pie
saying, if
grows.
the pie happens to accidentally get bigger, inequality doesn't necessarily make things worse because I'm getting the
Yeah.
same amount of a bigger piece of pie.
Yes.
Yeah. But the debate is whether inequality decreases economic growth or is neutral.
Well,
So I need to hear from you why inequality doesn't really affect.
we're trying to point the flaw in the causal logic of the argument that it's not income inequality that hinders economic growth, but it's a condition that results. It comes after the economic growth. So economic growth causes inequality in this case. So it's not, you know, we're not arguing opposite necessarily. It's just
Yeah.
that your argument is a different thing.
Yes.
But with regards to behavioral economics, income inequality in a free market actually positively influences the behavior of everyone. The economy rewards those who work to attain wealth, and this possibility is exemplified by the many people who have worked hard to achieve wealth. This behavior stimulates the economy because people work hard, which increases GDP. They spend money to get educated. When they get jobs, they work harder. They're more creative because they want to invent that technology that's going to put them to the top. And while not necessarily every single person is going to see the greatest return and become super rich, the fact that that productivity is increased, that benefits the economy as a whole. And people see government intervention as the primary solution in terms of economic inequality, but the argument there is that you're considering more of the social factors, and the fact is that Noah's Arthur Okun, who wrote that, who referred to it as the leaky bucket effect, when the government, you know, taxes and they want to gain revenue to put into things like social welfare, a lot of that money gets lost in transit. So this revenue that they're gaining is being lost, and they don't know the effects of what they're doing. Sometimes their agenda is to just simply give a short-term solution in order for them to look better. They're not always doing it in consideration of how it affects the economy and, you know, what effects it may have. So simply put, the government doesn't take into account all the possibilities. They're inefficient, and they shouldn't be trusted to solve such an issue at the risk of damaging the economy. And so ultimately, that's why we don't think that income inequality negatively impacts economic growth.
Okay, you guys can rebut what they've said for a couple of minutes, and we'll have an opportunity to rebut what they said originally. Not their rebuttal of their rebuttal, but go for their original argument.
So you guys spoke about China as an example of a country with both strong economic growth and high income disparity. But provide an analogy to USSR before them, a very high level of interregional disparity exists within China as it did in USSR. This type of inequality is much more, quoting again from Milanovic, much more politically destabilizing than intra-regional inequality. So this inequality leads to political instability, or can lead to political instability, and political instability leads to uncertainty, which causes investors to pull out of the region, which damages the economy. And furthermore, this instability can eventually lead to political collapse, which can, well, obviously will damage the economy in the long run, as it did in the USSR.
Okay, the second part of our rebuttal, you talked about how, you know, the income inequality was an incentive, and that your hard work could help the poor and middle class to close that gap between them and the wealthy class. But we think that that's pretty idealistic. It's sort of the American dream approach. If you work hard, you know, you'll make a ton of money, you'll be rich, but it just doesn't happen. Hard work doesn't have those types of returns. And that most of your lifetime wealth is actually, like, a large percent of it is determined right at your birth, where you're born, the city, the state, the country, your race, your gender, your parents' income, your parents' education level. That determines basically the bracket which you can realistically increase your standard of living and close that gap between the middle class, the poor class, and the upper class. So if you're an African-American woman in the rural USA, your parents have a low income, they have a low education level, no matter how hard you work, the chances that you're going to close that gap to become upper class is so slim. It's impossible. And so that's, you know, it really doesn't work. I mean, even when you talk about interregional inequality, if one state, one province is poorer than the richer one, I mean, if you look at it between countries, the top 3% of India, the top 3% of the richest Indians are wealthier than the bottom 5% of Americans. Which means that 97% of India is poorer than all of Americans. So you could move up so far in India and still be very relatively poor. This is what you were talking about, how if there's poor and super poor, rich and super rich, it's all about relative income. You know, poor and rich is a relative term. So that's what that is.
Okay, thank you. And your chance to rebut their argument.
Yeah, I think the argument, or what my opponents have failed to realize, is that correlation doesn't imply causation. And which is at the heart of the argument here, that does income inequality directly cause economic downturns? And we disagree. And for looking at a study by Michael Bordeaux from the Bank of International Settlements, he tried to analyze the relationship between income inequality and the 2008 Great Recession. And he tried to look at empirical evidence to support the hypothesis that basically my opponents are suggesting, that high levels or increasing levels of income inequality led to the crisis in 2008. Using some data from a panel of about 14 countries, he realized that credit booms are more than likely to lead to financial crises, but income inequality, there was no evidence to suggest that income inequality led to credit booms. So in other words, yes, credit booms absolutely are more likely to lead to financial crises, but there's no causal logic, causal relationship linking income inequality to credit booms and in turn financial crises. Secondly, Edward Glassier of Harvard University, economist of Harvard University, looked at the relationship between housing rates, increasing housing rates in the United States and the relative inequality. And he concluded that there were some places in the United States that didn't see a lot of increase in housing rates, prices during the 2008, or leading up to the 2008 financial crisis, and where there was like large gaps of inequality, which we'd assume would happen if the relative income hypothesis held true. So in other words, there wasn't necessarily, again, a causal relationship linking large degrees or sort of increasing levels of income inequality to the financial crisis of 2008. Also, we definitely agree that over the past 30 years, we've seen rising levels of income inequality. But it's one thing to claim that rising levels of income inequality, we've recognized that it's grown over the past 30 years, and it's another to say that that's directly caused the recession of 2008. And Michael Roberts, the author of The Great Recession, suggested that the problem with this argument is that it takes on a very Keynesian sort of way of thinking.